We live in a society that is in a hurry, that values speed. And so we have jet planes that enable us to be able to travel to faraway places very quickly. We have high-speed wireless internet so that we can work, no matter where we are, more rapidly. We have freeway system so that we can go to places faster. Or at least that was the intention when they were first built and constructed. Do you know that during your lifetime you will spend the equivalent of 6 months just sitting at traffic lights? So that whether you are driving on the freeway or even side streets, you are going to discover that your patience is tried, that you will find the experience one filled with irritation and frustration. But you may have noticed that when you are sitting at a red light, when it turns green, if within 2 seconds you haven't moved, the car behind you, the guy turns red, right? I heard about a fellow who's sitting at a traffic light and his car stalled. The light turned green and he couldn't get his car started. And of course, within a few seconds, the guy behind him is laying on his horn. And so after a little while, the fellow got out of his car and walked back to the man behind him and he said, "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't get my car started. But if you would like to go try and help me, I'll be glad to help you and sit here and honk your horn." That is an experience that is very, very trying for many of us. And yet, do you know that mapping and traffic service has estimated that commuters will spend about 100 hours in traffic every year on average? And you know what cities have the most traffic congestion in the world? Number one is Mexico City, Mexico. Secondly is Bangkok, Thailand. Thirdly is Istanbul, Turkey. Fourth is Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And fifth is Moscow, Russia. Now, in the United States, guess what city is the most congested on their highways? Los Angeles, California, followed by San Francisco, and then New York City, and Seattle, and San Jose. Notice that 3 of the 5 top cities are all in California. Now, for many, waiting in traffic, or for anything, has become one of the most hated and frustrating experiences in life. It's not just traffic. We wait in the bank. We wait in the supermarket. We wait in the doctor's office. We wait on the phone with customer service. Even at restaurants when we go out to eat. Do you realize that the nicer the restaurant, the longer you have to wait? You know, you wait to be seated, then you wait to get a menu, then you wait to order, then you wait for your food, then you wait for the check, and then you wait to pay at the register. And the restaurant has the nerve to call the guy that is serving you the waiter. The customer is the waiter who waits a lot. And no matter where we are in life, it is very difficult to be able to wait. Now, the Chinese have had it with long lines. In one of their crowded cities, entrepreneurs have created a niche market opportunity called standing in line professionals. The new occupation is composed primarily of migrant workers who wait in lines for roughly 60 cents a gig. One couple says that now they make more money than the county chief by just taking advantage of the impatience that exists in a highly congested society. So much of our time is spent waiting, and we don't like to wait. Some time ago, Time magazine published an article by Nancy Gibbs entitled "How America Has Run Out of Time." And in it, she reported how time has become the scarcest of commodities in American culture, and how people are willing to pay for the opportunity to save even an hour of it. Well, for many, that is about the worst thing that you can do. You know, we can learn a lot about people by just watching them wait. For example, people waiting at elevators. You'll notice that people just get so impatient that they have to do something. First, there's the bouncers. You know, just kind of bounce up and down. You know, they just can't stand still because they're waiting for that elevator. Then there's the swayers that just kind of move back and forth while they're waiting for that car to come. Then there's the punchers, the guy that keeps hitting, the little button. It's already red, so you know that the car's been called, but somehow he feels like he's going to get it there quicker, but he has to do something. He just can't stand there because he's so impatient. Well, you really do need patience in every area of your life. And if you have a problem with patience, then this section that we come to today in the book of James is for you. Because we're going to learn in this series that we have had on survival, how to survive divine delays. We've been seeing all through James that faith is a fight. And one of the struggles that we have is with patience. Now let me review for you the context of the passage we come to today in the book of James in chapter 5, verses 7 through 12. Last week, we saw in the first 6 verses of James chapter 5, how to survive unfair treatment, because the people to whom this letter was written in the first century were being taken advantage of, were not being paid the money that they were owed from the rich people they worked for, and they were actually being sued in court for nothing that they had done wrong, and yet being found guilty because of the crooked judges who were being bribed by wicked rich men. Now, these poor Christians who were suffering for their faith cried out to God for justice, for help. And the Lord responded by promising to judge the evildoers and to even the score. But it didn't happen right away. Justice wasn't served immediately. And so James had to encourage those beleaguered believers to be patient and to wait for Christ to come, who would take vengeance on those who deserved righteous condemnation. Now, you may not be in the exact situation as those suffering saints back then, and yet you may be growing weary of waiting for God, waiting for him to provide for you in some way, like waiting in the waiting room. It's kind of like that, it seems. The issue for you may not be the same as it was for the people back in James' day. It may be somewhat different. And yet, it could still be like you're waiting in a waiting room. You ever had that experience? Not long after I came to the church, our granddaughter, Amanda, came to live with us for a year. She was about 12 years of age. And one day, she was not feeling well. She had a side ache. She wasn't hungry. She didn't eat supper, which was very unusual. And so we got a little concerned, and I called a nurse, and they suggested that we go to the hospital. We were concerned that she might have appendicitis. And she didn't have insurance, and so we had to go to an emergency room at a county hospital, and we had to sit and wait. Now, we were afraid that her appendix might burst, and we felt that we were in an emergency. And yet we saw so many other people that we felt didn't have nearly the same problem, not nearly as severe case as us, being able to go before us in this crowded waiting room, and yet we had to wait. I kept going up to the counter and telling them about our situation and telling them that we needed to see a doctor. But we had to wait, and that was hard. Finally, she was able to be seen by a doctor and actually had surgery that night. But being in a waiting room is difficult, isn't it? When you're impatient to try to get some answers. And maybe you feel like you're in a waiting room today. Well, we're going to see today that patience is really the best prescription for the patient in the waiting room of problems. So if that's where you are now, waiting for your health concerns to improve, or your financial situation to be resolved, or your fractured relationships to be mended, or your passionate prayers to be answered, God has a word for you in his word. And we're going to learn some things about patience that's going to help us. The word patience, endurance, and perseverance are mentioned no less than 6 times in the 6 verses in this section of the book of James today. And James presents several truths about patience that apply to all of us. And you may or may not be able to see these. But the first is the fact that we need patience to be calm. In case you're filling in the blanks on the sermon supplement, we need patience to be calm. In verse 7 of James chapter 5, he says, "Be patient then, brothers, until the Lord's coming." Now, as I mentioned to you, the people to whom James was writing were experiencing tremendous difficulty, discrimination, even persecution. The wicked wealthy had committed all kind of injustices against these believers. And the word patience that James uses here in James 5:7 literally means long suffering. It stresses the idea of non-retaliation by holding one's spirit in check. W. Vine, in his expository dictionary of Old and New Testament words, defines it this way: long-suffering is the quality of self-restraint in the face of provocation, which does not hastily retaliate or promptly punish. In other words, it stays calm. Now, in the context, James is reminding these people that since God has promised to punish their oppressors, they need to patiently wait for him to do so. This aspect of patience is the ability to simply suffer for a long time under the mistreatment of others without growing resentful or bitter. James is the one who is writing this, but his half-brother Jesus is the perfect example of long-suffering. As you know, he was verbally and physically abused. He was spat upon, falsely accused, beaten, nailed to a cross where he suffered for 6 hours before dying. Yet he did not retaliate. He remained calm. And this peaceful, long-suffering attitude is to control the believer as well until Christ returns. In other words, until Jesus comes and rights all of the wrongs, the believer is to leave vengeance in his hands. Just be patient until the Lord gets here. He is going to come. We don't know when, but think how long it was before he came in the first place. And for hundreds of years, God had been promising and picturing the fact that the Messiah was going to arrive. And at the right time, Jesus came. And that'll be true of his second coming. It is certain and sure to occur. So we can remain calm as we wait. But there is a reason that it is delayed. And the reason is given to us in 2 Peter 3:9. The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, Peter says, as some understand slowness. He is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. One reason the Lord is delaying his coming is to give more people an opportunity to come to him, to trust him, to receive his forgiveness, and to allow him to give him eternal life. Now, to illustrate how to wait patiently, James uses another example from Palestinian culture in verse 7 of James chapter 5, verse 7, when he says, "See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, and how patient he is for the autumn and spring rains." Now, Clement, the Greek church father in AD 150, tells us that James and his brother Jude, who wrote the book of Jude in the New Testament, were both farmers. Apparently, they didn't follow the same occupation as their father Joseph did, as Jesus did, and become carpenters. And that explains why James so often uses vivid references to farm life as he does here. Now, the farmers sowed seed on the ground that received no rain at all during much of the year. The fields were brown, the soil was dry. Because modern irrigation techniques were unknown, they simply had to depend on the rain that came during 2 basic rainy seasons: the autumn or the early rain, was that which came to Palestine in late October or early November. And that softened the ground after the blistering heat of summer. And then the spring or the latter rains were the light showers that caused the grain to ripen, and they came in April or May. And without that, even heavy winter rains would not prevent crop failure. And so the Bible often refers to these two seasons, and the farmer depends on them. He's not disappointed. He's not deterred by delay. He simply plants his seed, and then he waits for his harvest. And we likewise are to wait for the process by which God will eradicate evil and vindicate his people. Now, in your situation, you may not be waiting for retribution, but for resolution of your problems. And you might be tempted not to stay calm when your problems are not resolved, when your concerns are not alleviated, when your needs are not met, at least not in the way you feel like they ought to be met. So we're tempted to fret and to worry and to be stressed, to be agitated rather than staying calm, cool, and collected. But that's what the biblical patience provides for us, an inner calm. Phillips Brooks was a famous New England preacher who was known for his poise, for his calm, for his patience. And yet there were times when he too, like many of us, would get a little uptight and impatient. And a friend of his found him that way one time when he walked into his office and he found Brooks pacing back and forth like a caged lion. And he said, "Phillips, what's the matter? What's the problem?" And Brooks said, "The problem is I'm in a hurry and God's not." Well, he's never in a hurry. And this man of God soon calmed himself back down, being assured again of that truth and that God was in control, and became his poised self again. You see, patience is the best prescription for the patient in the waiting room of problems. We all need patience to be calm. And secondly, we need patience to be courageous. We read in verse 8 of James chapter 5, "You too must be patient and take courage, for the coming of the Lord is near." Now here, patience is connected with the word courage, which the phrase "take courage" is variously translated as strengthen your heart, establish your hearts, or stand firm. The Greek word actually means to stand fast or firm, which conveys the idea of strengthening and supporting something so that it will stand firm and unmovable. One commentator concluded that James is saying that their personal duty was to develop an attitude of courage and firmness in facing their circumstances. So James is saying that they are to make their courage and purpose firm. And to do that, a believer in Jesus Christ must learn to live in anticipation of the Lord's return, and so not get upset when circumstances are difficult. Now, the patience that we're to exhibit in the light of Christ's coming is not passive. It's not just taking it. In fact, that's where patience kind of gets a bad rap. Patience is not a passive virtue. It's standing in there. It's hanging tough when you want to quit, when you want to retaliate and get even. Real patience or steadfastness involves making your heart firm so that you can deal with difficult times courageously. The truth that makes it easier to be patient, in the sense of having courage when facing tough times, is knowing that the Lord's return for his people is imminent. That's the clear implication of his coming being near, which is what James said here. Take courage, for the coming of the Lord is near, or as the New King James and the New American Standard Version render it, his coming is at hand. The word undeniably indicates that the coming of Christ could be at any time, that it is imminent. The early Christian conviction was, and they firmly believed it, that the rapture could transpire momentarily before the terrible tribulation period of judgment took place on earth. You see, nothing prophetically has to occur before the return of Christ for us to come and take us to himself. In October of 2007, San Diego experienced an evacuation that was the greatest in the history of California. 350,000 people were evacuated from their houses, over 1 million people displaced. It was the greatest evacuation in our country because of fire, because there were 6 simultaneous fires burning just east of San Diego. Now, that evacuation of people out of their homes is similar to something that's going to happen, except a lot quicker, in the rapture, when suddenly there are millions of people that are simply going to be taken out of this world. They're just going to, in a blink of an eye, going to be removed. And the reason is similar to that of the evacuation in San Diego, and that is to take them out of danger of the earthquakes and the fires and the world chaos that is going to take place during what is known as the Great Tribulation that breaks out on the earth. And God's people are going to be rescued and taken out of that most difficult of all times in the history of the world. And so believers, as we're facing much more mild difficulties, are to be patient and waiting for the Lord to come and for that event to happen, because patience is the best prescription for the patient in the waiting room of problems, because it helps us not only to be calm, but to be courageous. Thirdly, we need to be patient to be content, James says in verse 9. Patience to be content. Don't grumble, he said, about each other, my brothers and sisters, or God will judge you. Now, this next command seems kind of be out of place in this context until we stop and think about what is our normal response to persecution and difficulty. What do we usually do when we begin to feel the heat? We complain to anybody that will listen, right? And we lash out at each other because of the pressure that we're feeling. In addition, we tend to gripe about others who aren't going through the same struggles that we are facing. The idea of the word grumble in this passage, when he says don't grumble, is to complain, to criticize, to find fault. We ask, why don't they have financial problems like I do? Boy, it must be nice to have it made like those people do. Or, do you think they're doing something illegal to be able to afford a house like that? Another translation gives us another clue as to what might have been going on during these hard times. The New English Bible says, my brothers, do not blame your troubles on one another, or you will fall under judgment. And there stands the judge at the door. Once again, for the third time in 3 verses, James refers to the coming of Christ, who will not only judge the world of unbelievers, but will also require Christians to give an account of themselves before the judgment seat of Christ. Now, this is a constant theme in the New Testament. The second coming of Christ is mentioned 318 times in 260 chapters in the New Testament. It's found in 1 out of every 25 verses. So it obviously is important. So James says, rather than grumble about our situation to others and or complain about our state being worse than others or blaming others, James says that we're to be the opposite. We're to be content in what we have and where we are in life. And again, there's another reference to the imminent appearance of the Lord in the description of him at the end of this verse. It says, the great judge is coming. He's standing at the door. He's about ready to enter into the world again. And when he arrives, you don't want him to find you complaining and griping and criticizing. No matter what your circumstance, you need to learn to be content so that you don't grumble. That's what the Apostle Paul did. In Philippians chapter 4, he said, I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. And what can help you do this is being patient or long-suffering, no matter what happens. You know, many people would assume that they would be content if they won $590 million, right? But what about if when you're standing in line to get a ticket that's going to be the winning ticket, someone comes and cuts in front of you and they get that ticket? On May 18th, 2013, Mindy Crandall, age 34 at the time, was standing in line in Florida at a Publix store to purchase a Powerball jackpot ticket. And while she was tending to her two young daughters, 84-year-old Gloria McKenzie cut in line. Now, Mindy's 10-year-old daughter, Mallory, noticed and said, "Mom, that lady just cut in front of you." The clerk heard that, and he actually held up the purchase to allow Mindy to retain her spot, but she politely declined and said, "No, that's okay. Let the lady go in front." 3 weeks later, that lady, McKenzie, stepped forward as the winner. Mallory saw her on TV, recognized her, and believe it or not, she remained content. She said, "It could have been us, but things happen. Sometimes it's better to be patient than right." I knew we were teaching our daughter the right thing. She went on to say that she hoped the money would truly bless Mackenzie and her family. You think it would help her at all to know that the $590 million actually ended up only being $270 million after the taxes? Probably not. Patience is the best prescription for the patient in the waiting room of problems. It helps us to be content. Impatience fuels discontent. So James says, you need to learn to be content. And then he said, we need patience to be comforted. To be comforted. In verses 10 and 11 of James chapter 5, he says, "Brothers, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we consider blessed those who have persevered." Now here, James gives us some encouragement from the Old Testament. There have been those who've gone before us, who've walked the path of disapproval and difficulty. And as an example of patience, James suggests that we look back at the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord and suffered greatly for it. And there's many examples: Moses, David, Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, just to name a few. There are at least 11 passages in the New Testament that refer to the persecution of the prophets in the Old Testament. James' point is that the prophets suffered not because they did something wrong, but because they were doing right. They were doing good, and it just wasn't appreciated. These men spoke for God, and yet they were opposed, and they were persecuted by their contemporaries for their testimony. But the Lord provided comfort for them, and comfort for his suffering people at that time through them. So that, for example, in Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 18, he said, "I would comfort myself in sorrow, because my heart is faint in me." Jeremiah was known as the weeping prophet because he had visions that told him what was going to happen as God revealed it to him, and he had to announce that judgment was coming to this backslidden nation of Israel. And it tore him up emotionally to know the awful things that were going to happen to his fellow Israelites. And so God provided some comfort and consolation. And he said, I was able to comfort myself from the comfort God gave to him. Isaiah likewise had to deliver a message of warning to the Jewish people about the consequences for their sin. But his message also was one of hope and comfort. And so Isaiah said in Isaiah chapter 40, "Comfort, yes, comfort my people, says your God. Speak comfort to Jerusalem." That is a passage that is famous from the Messiah by Handel. It's one of the great solo parts in that beautiful musical. Then there is an example of a man who suffered perhaps more than anyone else in Old Testament time. His name has become synonymous with suffering, who was Job. And James is actually the only New Testament writer who mentions the name of Job. But he does so in verse 11 when he said, "You've heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about." Now you know the story of Job, how God allowed Satan to attack this most righteous man on all of the earth. And as a result, he lost his 10 children, He lost his entire fortune. He lost his physical health. He was struck with boils from the crown of his head to the bottom of his feet. He sat in an ash heap on a dunghill in misery and agony. His wife turned against him, told him to curse God and to commit suicide. 3 friends, so-called comforters, came to see him, and among other things, they told him that his suffering was due to his sin. And they put a guilt trip on him. Wasn't exactly a great help to him. And yet Job did not give in to the pressure that was applied to him, both by the spirit being Satan and by the human being, friends. Job responded with incredible, James says, perseverance, which means steadfast endurance. Now, how was he and the other prophets able to do that and stay faithful to their God in the midst of all these harsh circumstances and conditions? Well, James says that it's by patience he suffered long. He wasn't a perfect man, but his patience was such that today, whenever we see someone going through some severe difficulties and they're handling it rather well, we say of them, wow, he must have the patience of Job. He's known for it. It's that patient faith that enabled this godly man to say such things as this in Job chapter 19. I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the end he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes, I and no other. How my heart yearns within me. And he said that while he was suffering in pain. And so God honored him. James said in verse 11 of James 5, the Lord is full of compassion and mercy. And this is what he did for Job. We read in Job 42, after Job had prayed for his friends, the ones that had been telling him that he was a sinner, the Lord made him prosperous again, gave him twice as much as he had before. The Lord blessed the latter part of Job's life more than the first part. God ultimately comforted Job because of his long-suffering patience. You see, we can't be comforted if we are reacting to our negative lot in life with anger and blame and self-pity and depression. It's only if we're staying the course, if we're keeping the faith with a patience that keeps us on an even keel, that God can minister to us with comfort and consolation and encouragement and joy. The Shane family live in Alaska. Walter Shane lives on St. Paul Island in the Bering Sea with his wife and children. And when they get an urge for pizza, Walter calls in the order, and then they patiently wait for 3 days. The fast food is jetted to them via Reeve Alertian Airways in a flight from Anchorage. And it costs them the price of the pizza plus $25 for shipping. And if the weather is bad, or if the flight is canceled, well, then it may be 3 more days that they wait for their fast food. But you see, their patience pays off finally when they get their comfort food. Patience comes before comfort. You see, it's the best prescription for the patient in the waiting room of problems because it enables us to be comforted. And then finally, James says we need patience to be controlled in what we say. In verse 12 of James chapter 5, he said, but above all, my brethren, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or with any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no, no, lest you fall into judgment. Now here's James' final point on patience. Now this last verse in this section has been cut off from the first 11 verses that we looked at by many commentators, because at first glance, it doesn't seem to fit with the subject of patience. But the connective at the beginning of the verse, when he said, but, obviously shows that it is a bridge between this final instruction and that which has gone before. There's the relationship between this prohibition against oaths and the theme of patience. Because when he says don't swear here, he's not talking about cussing or blaspheming God. He's talking about taking an oath. Now, the words of James are very similar to those spoken by Jesus in Matthew chapter 5, who said, "You've heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'Do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made.' But I say to you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. Simply let your yes be yes, and your no be no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one." Now, some have taken these words of Jesus and James to teach that taking an oath in a court of law or in any swearing-in ceremony is wrong. When Herbert Hoover was sworn into the office of President of the United States, he used the words "I affirm" instead of "I swear," because he was a Quaker and felt that swearing was a violation of this commandment against oath-taking. Others say that this teaches that we should not take any oaths or ever call on God to witness what we say. But the Old Testament does not prohibit the use of any oath in court. And others, such as the Apostle Paul, called on God as a witness that what he was saying was true. Paul did that in 1 Thessalonians 2:5, for example. In fact, even God took an oath under certain conditions. He did it back in Genesis 22 as well as in Hebrews chapter 6. Oath-taking was a common practice in James' day, and it was a much abused one at that. People took solemn pledges to assure others that they were on the level, that what they were about to say was true, and that what they said they would do, they would indeed do, and it would get done. But what James is saying is that honest men and women do not have to resort to taking oaths in their normal, everyday conversation. There should be no need to swear that what one is saying is true, and to call on anyone, much less God, to back up our word. The only reason to do it is if we think our words wouldn't be believed. But our conversation should be so honest that no one would ever doubt us. Too much affirmation of truth actually arouses suspicion. When you swear to God before making a statement, it's as if you're saying, well, now I'm going to swear to God. Now I'm going to say something that's true in contrast to what I've already said, which, was not so much. Believers should not be punctuating their speech with oaths to emphasize the fact that they're telling the real truth about whatever they're saying. They should always be honest and truthful in everything they say, that their yes always means yes, the no always means no. Oaths should not be necessary because people know that when you make simple statements, are completely trustworthy and dependable. Don't exaggerate or stretch the truth or only tell half the truth, so that when you say something, people know it's truth and you don't have to swear to God. Now, specifically, James is talking about the practice of indiscriminate oath-taking during times of hostile confrontation. When one is being persecuted and accused of wrongdoing illegitimately, as the people in James' day were, he may be tempted to deny his guilt by reinforcing his plea with an oath that calls on God as a witness, instead of just depending on God to defend him or deal with the situation. And likewise, when you're impatient, you are more apt to want others to believe you more quickly than usual, and so you resort to punctuating your statements with such statements as, "I swear to God," or "honest to God," or "as God is my witness," or "I swear on a stack of the Bibles," or "this is the gospel truth," to get others to accept that what you're saying is true more quickly, more readily. Of course, you may have to say that if you're not the one who tells the truth, if everyone suspects that what you say is not true. Back in 1891, a man by the name of Desjardins confessed to the murder of a duke. Shortly after, however, he repudiated it. He took it back. And he, therefore, in court, defended himself by claiming that he was a notorious liar. And he was completely unreliable. he called a whole bunch of witnesses in to indeed tell the court that this guy really had bad character and you really couldn't believe much of what he says. And so the court found that he was actually not guilty on the basis that no one could believe a word he said when he confessed to the crime. Now, that tendency to lie might help in court sometimes, although I've never heard of that before. But it's certainly not going to help you much with God. He says that what we need to do is to be always telling the truth and just patiently depending on God to handle our situation so that you'll be more controlled in the way you talk and you won't use oaths indiscriminately and improperly. But the key is patience, which is the theme of James' letter and his teaching to us. Hudson Taylor was a famous missionary to China, and he often recruited others to become missionaries as well. And he used to always say that there's 3 requirements to be a good missionary. There's 3 qualities that you need to have if you're going to be a missionary. First is patience. Second is patience. Third is patience. And we need that too. Now, William Carey was a very well-known, successful missionary to India. And after he'd been there for some time, he had an associate come over who was a printer. And they prepared Bibles for distribution. See, Carey had spent years in learning the language so that he could translate the scripture into a local dialect. On top of that, he had spent hours and hours and hours in meticulous study to make a dictionary and a grammar so that those who followed behind him would have the tools to do more translation. While he was away on a trip, tragedy struck. And when he came back, his printer friend ran to greet him and with tears in his eyes told him that this horrific fire had broken out, burned down everything. All the buildings, the printers, the Bibles, and mostly the worst, the grammars and the dictionaries. Immediately, William Carey dropped to his knees and without impatience, without anger, he thanked God that he still had the strength to do the work all over again. And by God's grace, he was able to replicate everything that he did before. So by the time he died, he had the translations, he had the dictionary, he had the grammar, and it was better than what he'd done before. Because he was a man of patience. Because when you're facing critical times, the best prescription for a patient in a waiting room of problems is patience. Because when you have patience, it'll help you be calm and courageous and content and comforted and controlled in what you say. So you need to be patient day by day. You'll be much more prepared to survive divine delays. Now, on your card that was referred to earlier in your program, on the back side, I've suggested that you just commit to memory a very short part of a verse. In James chapter 5, verse 7, just be patient, brethren, until the Lord's coming. Be patient, brethren, until the Lord's coming. Be patient, brethren, until the Lord's coming. Let's say that together. Be patient, brothers, until the Lord's coming. That's the message of this passage. And so from that, I'm asking you if you might make a couple of commitments. Number one, determine to be more patient when you face those irritating or painful situations in life. Will you do that? If you need patience, will you make a determination, a decision now, I'm going to be more patient? If so, if you would check that and place that in the offering plate in a moment, I'll pray for you that will actually happen. And then secondly, daily pray that God would help me be a more patient person, especially in hard times. Many people who are impatient don't think to pray that God would help them be patient. If you've been willing to do that, and commit yourself to do it. If you would jot that down, I'll pray that that'll be true. And so let me pray with you. Father, I thank you for the way you do take care of us. I thank you that you've made it possible for us to be characterized by patience. I pray, Lord, that you will give to each of us the patience we need through your Spirit. We know that one of the fruit of your Spirit is patience. Help us to be dependent on you. And we pray, Lord, that you will make us a people who will be characterized by patience as well as love and joy and peace as we live our lives. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.